let's talk a little bit about some new and improved tools that, just as we have new and better tools to detect cheating with, in our course management system and so forth, there's new and better online tools for student too. So I'll go over some broad things and then we can talk about other ways of dealing with them. Okay, so I put together an online document, and you're welcome to just click on that or scan the code in. If you don't have a QR code reader, if you have Snapchat or Google, the Google app on your phones, you can use a camera in that and it'll take you right to the document. So if you want to see whether, for example, there's any material on some of these sites from your students, it's not a bad place to check. I found some interesting things are posted from my classes and lots of other classes. I'd encourage you to do that. I'll just pause for a second here if you'd like to jump along. I also, I guess, can probably put that link into the chat. So here, if anyone would like to just click on that link, it'll be there. So academic dishonesty and archives of materials from old classes are certainly nothing new. You know, we've all heard of fraternities and sororities and other groups maintaining lists of materials from old classes, from old exams and old assignments and graded exams and assignments and so forth. But with the availability of the internet, the scale of this has increased quite a bit. Typically, these were local in the past where they were just for your class or for classes taught at your institution. And it was generally a small number of people storing information there and generally sharing it with a small scale. One argument for the existence of these tools on the internet is that it makes it more equitable. Everyone has access to these materials, where before it was limited to members of fraternities, sororities, and their friends. So at least in some ways it levels the playing field. But it's something. But the main reason for talking about it is just so we're aware of what is out there. Many people I know will put their old exams online anyway, and that also provides for much more equitable access. You know, a more significant concern of the people who give the same exams year after year and the same assignments, and we'll see what happens to some of those as we go through. So we're going to talk about some broad categories, some broad tools that are used. There's course material sharing and tutoring sites out there for where students can go and join. There are papers where, for papers, there are students for hire and services for hire, where people often in developing countries will work at very low rates and write papers for others. And we even have some former adjunct faculty that's shown up in some Chronicle articles and so forth, who go out and will work for these services because they're not paid all that much while they're teaching. So this is a way of supplementing their income a little bit. And we'll also talk about some of the ways in which plagiarism detection software, such as we use on our campus, can be pretty easily defeated. So in terms of course material sharing and tutoring sites, there's some big ones. And they will store old graded exams, graded assignments, posted lecture notes, and any materials pretty much that are shared with the students can be shared, can be scanned in and posted on these sites. And they also provide tutoring services, sometimes provided by former successful students in the services and in the classes. Sometimes faculty will join these things, where people are basically paid to assist students with their assignments, with online exams and quizzes and other things. You know, having assistance and tutoring services is not bad, but quite often these services go a little beyond what we might consider appropriate in terms of help. Many of them will charge for access. In fact, most of them will charge for access, but a common way of doing that is that they'll provide any student free access if they upload a certain number of graded items. You know, so if a student uploads 10 or 12 or 15 pages of graded work from their class, they get a month or more of access to the service, and then they can get access to all the other classes that they have from past students. Course Hero is one of the biggest ones out there. The two that I've seen most students at Oswego using tend to be Course Hero actually Coufers. The two I've seen most often are Course Hero and Chegg, but there's also Coufers, Study Blue, eNotes, and Chegg. The first and the last of those are the ones that seem to be most popular locally, but any of those are possible. So you may want to periodically just check these sites and see what's available on them, or just do a search for your course and institution, and you'll often find Course Hero, Chegg, and sometimes the others coming up at the top of the list. So it's kind of interesting. I've had sometimes, the first time I heard about these sites were probably 6 or 7 years ago, when a student in an online class was posting information in a discussion forum, informing students of how useful these services are, so that they can study by looking at, tests that other people have posted, and if they signed up under her account, she'd be able to get some free access, and they could get discounted access to all the material shared there. It's something we should be aware of, and it's something we always should have been aware of, but a lot of us will often take the easy way out and keep using the same assignments and so forth. Here's a short video from Course Hero describing this service, and it's no longer available. Okay, I should have checked that. It was available a week or two ago. But if you go to their site, you'll find lots of materials where they describe what they do, and they market it as primarily assistance for students, but the assistance in practice often goes a little beyond just guiding students, and it sometimes involves actually doing the work for students in return for the payments that are provided. Let me see if I can move forward here. So, there's a number of solutions. This has been discussed on a number of online forums. It came up about a year and a half ago in the Teach Econ discussion forum on Facebook and online. And one thing that a lot of instructors have done, or at least a number of instructors have done as a way of dealing with this, is to file DMCA copyright infringement notices with sites that have material from your classes. And they will generally, after some process, take it down. That won't do away with the sites, but at least it would restrict your material being available. Another thing you could do is require current students that post course materials on the sites to take the material down, and then you have to go back and monitor it. Some faculty actually have signed up for accounts so they can monitor it more proactively. Most of these things, though, have the material, at least the headers and some broad information available online, because they want people to find them. So you don't generally, I haven't joined any of them, but I've been amazed at how much is posted on these sites. But that is a tactic that some people have used that has been fairly effective, where you tell students, or if you put it in your syllabus, you could tell them that if they don't take the materials down, they will fail the course and or academic penalty, or disciplinary procedures will be followed. One of the things I did this semester in my online course is I actually ran a search of my student names against some of these things, and I found one of my students has materials from about 12 or 13 courses and several hundred pages up on one of these sites. So at the very beginning of the term, I sent her an email suggesting that if any of the material from this course shows up there, that would be a violation of academic, integrity policies and so forth. I actually haven't found very much from my own courses up there, but I have found a lot from my colleagues in the economics department. The best strategy, in general, is to change assignments, tests, and online discussion prompts regularly. So just don't do the same thing. Keep the course fresh, and then it doesn't matter what access students have. In fact, if you're going to do that, you can share it with everyone, and it reduces the benefits of those sites. So have you had any experiences with any of this?
No. Not yet.
Not yet, but take a look and see, because there may be some things out there. And we've got something in chat here. Okay, Kristen said no. Okay, and let's see. and Jen hadn't looked at these. So take a look at them and do a search for the site and just type in Oswego, and you'll be amazed at how much material is there. In fact, we can just do that really quickly. Let's just jump over to look at that, hopping out for a second here. Let's go to Coursera because that's one of the most popular ones. And if we go there, there's a nice little search tool here. And let's just type Oswego. And what we'll see is a very large collection of documents here. Over 3,740 documents. And if you click on those, here's some, for example. This is from a labor economics class. And it's either mine or Luda's. And in fact, that looks like one of mine, and that wasn't there.
So can you see how to upload this one? I mean, who uploaded this one?
You generally can. I don't want to do that since we're recording it. But if we, so yeah, so there's, okay. I had said that my material isn't there. Here's some notes. This was actually uploaded in June, and well, it's a while back. But in any case, so there's a lot of materials there, and so it's grown quite a bit. And I do see we have some more people up here. Let's see who else is online now. Okay, we've got Ben there as well. So there's a link I shared at the beginning, Ben. It's in the chat. You should be able to get to it if you want to just search some of these links yourself. And there's a lot of materials there. And if you search for your course name online, there's a pretty good chance you might find some things there. So, and you notice there were some multiple choice questions online. Now, in my courses, in my principles class, I do use a lot of multiple choice materials, but it draws in my principles class from a pool of about 8,000 questions, where it's drawing from a pretty wide selection. So even if students posted it, they'd have trouble finding things. But in my other classes, that may be a little more difficult. But I do change the questions and add new ones all the time. One thing you can do for online assignments is set it up so it requires current information. For example, in my large class, right now I'm having students doing a peer-reviewed assignment where they have to go out and find articles in the news, but I restrict it to articles in the news in the last 6 months, for example, and then they can write up a discussion of how that article relates to the concept that they're analyzing and talk about how economic analysis is being used. And by requiring it to be current material, it makes it much harder for them to find previous examples because, they're disqualified if it's not within the time window. Or just continually update your assignments so they're always new. Plagiarism detection is something where we've become fairly comfortable with it being detected with either Turnitin or SafeAssign, which we have in Blackboard. There's a number of paraphrasing websites out there that do a fairly good job, basically, of taking a text that you copied from some online site and rewriting it for you by just using thesaurus lookups. And the resulting text will often look somewhat awkward and will not look very professional, and sometimes it won't make a lot of sense. But that's not always uncommon when we're looking at student writing. And it makes it a lot harder to detect because one of the usual giveaways with plagiarized material is that it often looks more professional than many of our students are right, or it perhaps may look much more polished than other work we've seen from the same students. But with a paraphrasing tool, they could take a very professional paper and turn it into something that looks like, mediocre or sometimes fairly high quality student work with just enough errors in it to make it harder to detect. And also to make it so that it will trick any of the plagiarism detecting software out there. Article rewriter tool is another one. There's paraphrasing online. And there's a complex sentence generator that will do the same sort of thing. There's Rewordify. And another thing I actually heard about from, this one I hadn't considered, came from the graduate assistant at CELT, who noted that she knows a popular strategy with Korean students on campus is to do a search for paper topics in Korean and then to copy the text of that and run it through Google Translate. And when you get the translated version of a Korean document or some other language document, it will come through as being something that looks like broken English translations from people who may not be all that proficient in English. And so it looks very much like something written by someone who has English as a second language, and it will fail all the plagiarism detection tests. So, you know, some of this is pretty hard to test. Another strategy, though, is there's some online plagiarism detection sites. Now, when you set up SafeAssign in Blackboard for an assignment, you have the option of letting students run a paper through and getting a report before they submit it, in which case they can just keep submitting it until they change enough words so it passes. But there's also, you know, if you don't do that, there's a number of sites out there, and here's two of them, where students can submit it to free plagiarism check software and get a report on what's been found out there. And the reports from that are very similar to the ones you get through SafeAssign. So they can basically keep changing words in the document until it passes the plagiarism check. So the automated plagiarism checks are far from perfect. But there's some even more clever strategies that are sometimes used, and that is to replace characters in the text, doing a global search and replace from a foreign character set, adding transparent characters between words, so you can put just letters in between words and make it so that they don't show up by making the type font white, you know, the same color. That one's pretty easy to test, by the way, by just running just blocking the text, because then those hidden letters will show up, and I have seen that in a few cases. Another thing you can do is you could modify the invisible text layer in PDFs by just scrambling the words. That requires a little more sophistication, but when you have a PDF that has embedded text, the text that's displayed is not the same necessarily as what it's searching, because it contains the text layer which is read by screen readers and other materials. You can scramble that so it will fail the plagiarism detection, even though the actual version that you see on the page is a very completely plagiarized document. And just in terms of the words, the letter substitution, the Cyrillic LE character is the same as our letter E. The Latin A is the same as our letter A. The Latin O is the same as our letter O. The Latin LE is the same as, or Cyrillic LE is RE. And basically, if they do a global search and replace where they change the one character throughout the document to this, it fails all the plagiarism tests. And that's become a fairly common strategy for sophisticated users. There's YouTube videos out there describing exactly how they can do this and how they can check it to make sure it's going to fail. A pretty good sign, by the way, of this is when you run it through a plagiarism detection program and you get a score of 0. I had one student in 2 classes a year or so ago, a year and a half ago, who did this in 2 separate classes with their final project, and it came back with scores of 0, and you never get scores of 0. And so I just copied some of the text and put it in Google and found the documents in about 10 seconds. But if I was just relying on SafeAssign, it would have failed because he was using this strategy. So one thing that happens now, this didn't always happen, is that SafeAssign will pop up a warning in papers that use multiple character sets. Now, for for international students, it's not uncommon for them to have a different character set, or another character set that will sometimes show up in some of the characters just because that's one of their built-in fonts on their Mac or their Windows machine. So, you have to be careful in accusing them of this, but it's at least a sign that maybe there's something going on, and you may want to just copy some of the text or just type the text into Google. And Google's pretty efficient at finding things. You can use Google to search for a sentence or two of suspect content, and that will almost always do it. And as I mentioned before, you could either change the background color on the text to make hidden characters appear, or just block the text. And, once you got the different shaded, you'll see hidden characters if there are any. A really good tactic that almost always works too is if you get a paper that, is suspect, but you haven't quite found it, is to ask the students to explain what they're saying in the text. And quite often they'll just break down and apologize, saying they ran out of time and so forth, and they couldn't get it together, so they copied. You don't generally have to accuse them, just ask them to come in and talk about it a little bit. And if they can explain it, it becomes pretty obvious pretty quickly. A more difficult problem is that we do have this gig economy out there, and we've got a lot of faculty out there too as well, where you can, we have one more person join. Okay, Paul's there. Hi, Paul. You could have someone else write the paper, and they don't always charge very much to do that. So let me move forward. When I jumped out, there's a number of services where they specifically do that. There's Prescott Papers, there's Custom Writings, there's GradeMiners.com, there's Turn Paper Custom, there's Writers Per Hour, where you just pay people by the hour to do it. And now some of these places will advertise themselves as giving you assistance or give you some research background or some background information that you can use to help develop your own papers. But basically, they charge to write a paper on any topic you give them. And because they are custom written papers, they will often pass any of the plagiarism detection. So the one thing, though, that often work is that because the people writing the papers often aren't paid very much, it's not uncommon for them to basically to plagiarize it themselves, because there's not really much the student can do to punish them if they get caught, because people who buy it don't always know the name of the author because they're doing it through one of these services, and it's unlikely that a student who got a plagiarized paper that they paid for would be very likely to sue the company issuing it. So, so basically what you have to hope is that if they're doing this, that they're not being that the person who's doing it for them is not putting much effort into it. Or on the other hand, because the papers may not be that polished, and some of these are students who work, on the side doing this thing, they will sound often very much like student papers, and it might be pretty easy to let it pass. If it's a higher quality paper or a plagiarized paper, there's no problem. The solution to that basically, well, once again, you can ask students to explain what they've written if you get something that's suspect. As I said, a lot of the work that's custom written tends to be plagiarized as well. And one other thing we should have mentioned here is that what was I going to say, is basically structuring the assignments and scaffolding them in such a way so that it's not likely they'd be able to do it. For example, I have a couple of classes, well, 2 classes where I have only one major project, but I have them first submit a proposal for the topic, and I'll give them some feedback and suggest sometimes a change in focus, and then I have them submit a bibliography, and then have them submit an annotated bibliography, then have them submit a review of the literature, and it would be fairly costly for them to get someone else to do all that. And if they've done all of that, writing the final paper isn't all that hard. So if you scaffold it so that you have them do it in stages throughout the semester, it's much less likely that they'll get frustrated at the end and just hire someone to do it. Or they'd have to hire someone at the very beginning and have them work all the way through, which is more costly and is probably I think it's probably much less likely. The other issue, as we saw, apparently some of my quizzes are up there that weren't there the last time I looked. So I'll have to make sure I've changed them even more, but I do tend to change them every semester a bit. If you're doing online question quizzes with test pools, if they're coming from a test bank, they're almost always on the internet within a few years, because sometimes even instructors will post a test bank to help students review. Right. Now, publishers, if they're notified, will file a takedown notice, but once they're out there, it's kind of hard to get them back. Do a search perhaps for some of the questions if you're using publisher questions, and you might very well find that they're already there, which means you may want to revise them a little bit, change the correct answer. So the existing correct answer is no longer correct. Adding the word not sometimes to the question stem can make a difference, or just rewriting it a bit can be helpful, but it's a lot more work. Many of those questions make their way into Quizlets and Kahoots and other review quizzing apps, which you might not find directly in a Google search, but they may be out there for students to use on their own. And sometimes students will just type them in from test questions that they've had. So, you can't really assume that they're out there all that often. The best strategy is use new question banks frequently. If you're using publisher-provided materials, change the textbook periodically, and particularly to a new textbook, which is sometimes risky. And many of the questions you get at first are not always very well reviewed. So it does require a lot of work if you're going to do that. And another strategy is make sure you rewrite the questions frequently. And for every test question, you can come up with multiple versions, put it in a pool, and have random drawings from that. So it's unlikely they'll get the same questions if they're going to take it multiple times or if they're going to share it. But again, it's not a perfect solution. And if you only use test banks from newish texts that are out in the last year or two, most of the questions won't be out there yet, but they get there pretty quickly. And another possibility is give only proctored quizzes. So if you're doing it in the classroom, that's no problem. But if you're teaching an online class, it's a lot more difficult. Now, some people will require lockdown browsers or other things where someone's monitoring you, but those are pretty easily defeated. They made a lot of sense back in the early days of the internet when people only had one device connected to the internet, and you could lock down the browser they were connecting. But now that everyone can get out their phones and their watches and their tablets, it's really easy to have multiple devices or to text questions to someone else or something else. If you're going to have proctored quizzes, they pretty much have to be done in person. I know there are some where they'll monitor the student, but students are pretty good at hiding what they're doing so that you can see their keyboard in their hands perhaps, or see their faces in the keyboard, but it's pretty easy to do something on a device under the table, and it's pretty hard to show that. A better strategy probably is using alternative assessments with only low stakes or no stakes quizzes. And in that case, they have less incentive to do this. In my large class, for example, I've got 96 or 97 graded items. And so they could try to find all this material, but it would be pretty hard. And again, it draws from a pool of about 8,000 questions that are used in smaller batches. And that's pretty much all I've got.